Hey, I'm Brant at Crocker Farm Auction, and I have a really neat Virginia stoneware jar here to show you that we're going to be selling in our upcoming 15th anniversary auction to take place July 20th, 2019. A lot of cool Virginia stoneware in this auction, a lot of neat other Alexandria Virginia stoneware, which is what this is, and I'm going to talk about in a minute. Some really neat Tidewater Virginia examples and other, obviously, Shenandoah Valley things like we usually have. But at any rate, I wanted to highlight this jar because I wanted people to understand just how rare it is and how special it is from an Alexandria stoneware collector's perspective, but also from an African American history perspective. So this jar bears a mark that at face value seems fairly common for Alexandria stoneware. It says Hugh, Smith and Co. Now, what's neat about this is there are other Hugh Smith potter's marks used, H.C. Smith, and you'll see like H.C. Smith, Alexa, D.C. That's a common one you see. But this is actually one of the rarest Alexandria stoneware makers marks, Hugh Smith and Co. in this. It's a bordered like a cartouche, and I mean, I grew up with this stoneware. My mom and dad collected it. I saw it all the time. And one mark that people really treasured was John Swan's mark. So it would say J. Swan, and that was marked. I mean that predates this jar, Swan's period at the pottery, owning the pottery. But this mark is probably rarer than that mark. And it was under the ownership of this merchant, Hugh Smith, that, if I understand it correctly, John Swan operated the shop owned by Hugh Smith. But at any rate, the pot itself appears to have been made by an enslaved African American who was owned by both Swan and then later Smith, and was eventually freed by Smith in 1829. But when this jar was made, and we can pretty tightly date this mark to like 1822 to 25, the person who made this was a slave. And so his name was Thomas Valentine, and on the bottom of this jar we see a letter T. Now, that might not seem like a lot, and it might seem like it's reaching to say that Thomas Valentine made this, but when you study Alexandria stoneware, there was kind of a peculiar thing about it, which is that the potters working at these shops were wont to inscribe their initials on the bottom. They really liked to do that. So there have been times where, for instance, there's another African American potter who worked at these shops named David Jarber, and there's actually a piece with a full inscription on the bottom of his name and a date. But there's other pieces that have a D on the bottom, and the D does seem to match the D that's on the more famous, fully inscribed David Jarber jar. So and the pieces seem to resemble it in other ways. So it seems like, yes, the pieces with the D's were all made by David Jarber. B.C. Milburn is a famous Alexandria potter. He sometimes would put an M on the bottom of jars, and other initials, things like that. So in this case, we can't identify another person that T would fit with. Meanwhile, the dates of when Valentine was owned by these people and when he was working at the shop match with the maker's mark. So it seems pretty clear that this is made by Thomas Valentine. Now, I said that there isn't a lot known about Thomas Valentine, but I had said that a fellow African American potter at this shop with Valentine, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if they worked there at the same time, but was David Jarber. And I found a really cool, it's kind of some new research, a petition that the free African American citizens of Alexandria signed in 1831 to decry Nat Turner's rebellion in the South and say that basically they were completely against that and they would do anything they could to prevent something similar from happening in Alexandria. And so there's a whole list of free black men on this petition. One of them is David Jarber and another is Thomas Valentine. I thought that was really interesting. It was at that point that Thomas Valentine had been freed. He was, as I said, freed in 1829. But I just really thought it was worth highlighting this just really great artifact from Alexandria history and African American history in what was then the District of Columbia. And we're really excited to sell it on July 20th, 2019.